to show you my favorite way to do a lap zipper for skirts and pants with a waistband. I think it's well suited for beginners and it's pretty straightforward. It's a particularly great method if you've ever struggled with getting a little bump at the base of the zipper, or if you've ever had trouble inserting a zipper along a curved hip, or if you're using a shifty fabric like rayon. This step-by-step tutorial is part 1 of my lap zipper series, where I'll be giving you all of my favorite tips and tricks for working lap zippers in different types of garments. Lap zippers are a great vintage technique where the zipper is hidden just under a flap of fabric formed by the seam allowance. I use them exclusively on my garments instead of invisible zippers because they look great, they're usually more reliable zippers, and they're easier to zip up. This particular lap zipper construction method in today's tutorial is perfectly suited for side seam or center back zippers in skirts and pants that have a waistband. And at the end of this tutorial, I'll give you a few more tips to make this a great method for you to try. As a bit of background, on a side zippered garment like these pants, typically the zipper is on the left side of the body, so that the overlap side is on the left of the seam as you're looking at the garment on the outside, and the underlap side is on the right. And you can see the zipper peeking out underneath that little lap. On a back zippered garment like this skirt, the orientation of the zipper is the same. But if you prefer the zipper on the right side of the body and opening in the opposite direction, then just reverse which side you start things on in this tutorial. I'm using a 5/8 inch seam allowance on this sample here. It's really the minimum seam allowance you can use for a lap zipper so that the top stitch side catches the seam allowance and the zipper tape in the top stitching, unless you're very well versed in the ways of industrial sewing methods, which I am not. Now, if you have a narrower seam allowance, like many earlier vintage sewing patterns have, that use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, you can just plan ahead and easily widen the seam allowance in your zipper area only to 5/8 of an inch, just like this example here. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and just in this little sample area where the zipper would go, this has been extended to 5/8 of an inch. And if you forget to widen the seam allowance ahead of time, you can always add a little fabric extension to extend the seam allowance after the fact, because it'll be tucked towards the inside of the garment and no one's ever going to see that. And that's also helpful if you need to end up letting the seam out at some point and you have less of a seam allowance to work with. This will be my sample. And before you start, I highly recommend interfacing the seam allowance on both sides of the seam where you'll be inserting the zipper to stabilize it. I like to use fusible stay tape from Emma Seabrook. It's perfect for this. I'll link it in the description. There's a knit and a woven, although I find that the knit works for all my needs. You want the interfacing to extend the entire length of the zipper area. So my interfacing has been applied to both seam allowances, and for this particular zipper method, I like to use a zipper that's a little bit longer than I need because I personally find it easier when top stitching. So I'll often use a 9-inch zipper and go for about a 7.5 inches for the actual zipper length in the garment and cut the rest of the zipper off after sewing the waistline seam. But I'll get into that when we get there. Vintage patterns often call for a 7-inch zipper, but use whatever length is easy for you to get into your garment. When you're ready to insert the zipper, we'll pin the entire seam shut from the waistband to the hem. We're going to baste the seam to the end of the zipper and then sew the rest of the seam underneath that. So on the piece that will be facing up when you're sewing, mark your seam allowance at the top edge of your fabric, which will eventually be the waistline seam. Then measure down from that line the length of the zipper, where we'll mark the zipper stop at the end. And your pattern may have a notch right at this point. This length here will be the exact length of your zipper from the very top teeth, which you can see here, to the end at the zipper stop. Or it's the length that you'll want this to be if you're using a bit longer of a zipper like I am here. Just keep in mind if you're using the exact length of zipper that you need, when you measure the length of the zipper down to the stop, that you have the teeth just outside that waistline marking that we added. And using our longest stitch length, we're going to baste from the top edge on our seam line down to the line that we marked for the end of our zipper, and then switch to a normal stitch length, take a few stitches, back stitch a little bit, and then continue to sew the rest of the seam to the hem. You'll thank me for this later, but take a seam ripper and rip open just the last basted stitch above the back stitching where the base of the zipper will be on both sides of the seam. This will make lining up your zipper and later taking out the basting stitches so much easier. Finish the raw edges of this whole seam however you'd like. The zipper area seam allowances must be finished separately since they'll be pressed open. I usually prefer to finish the rest of the seam allowance below it, trimmed and pressed together to one side, so first I take a clip into the seam allowance below the back stitching. Once your seam allowances are finished, press open the zipper seam allowance, which is the part you basted above the back stitching. If the pieces are curved for a hip, this might look a little ripply now, but don't worry. Now we're going to lay the zipper face down, centered on the basted seam allowance, and pin it and baste the left side of the zipper only, as we're looking at it right now, to just the seam allowance underneath it, not the garment fabric below that. This is setting up the underlap side of the zipper. By the way, if you want to inset the zipper a smidge more under the lap side, I'll talk about that in the tip section at the end. If you're using an exact length zipper, first mark the waistline seam allowance at the top on the left side of the pressed open zipper seam allowance, and with the zipper closed, make sure that the top zipper teeth and the pull are just outside of that seam line again when you pin this. But if you've got a longer zipper like I'm using here, instead of centering the zipper on the seam from the top, line up the zipper stop at the end of the zipper at the back stitching, and there will be a little hole above that since we ripped out that last basting stitch, so it makes it a lot easier to line up the zipper stop just under that. And then the extra length of the zipper will just hang off the top and we'll cut it off later. Whether you're lining up from the top with an exact length zipper or from the bottom if you have one longer than you need like me, pin if you need to for accuracy, and baste the zipper in place with the teeth centered on the seam, pinning it only to the seam allowance on the left side. You can also slide something under it so you don't catch the garment fabric. And I baste around the middle of the zipper tape. Now if you feel comfortable doing it on the machine, instead of pinning and hand basting, you can baste this side with a zipper foot and just lift up the zipper periodically to make sure that the teeth are in line with the seam line. I started at the bottom, by the way, which is why this looks like it's on the right side, and that's since I was using a longer zipper and I needed to make sure that my stop was in the right spot. But hand basting is great for accuracy and trickier fabrics and can be helpful if this is your first time trying it. So here's how it looks with the left side basted. As a caution, if your zipper is slightly to the left of that center seam line, as we're looking at it right now, that's totally okay. In fact, I'll tell you why you may want to do that in the tips at the end. But if it's edging closer to the right side, rip it out and rebaste it, because that means it won't be tucked under the lap side very well. So this left side of the zipper is basted, and we're now going to flip over the left part of the garment underneath this to the right, and in the process turn over the zipper so you're now looking at the zipper from the front side. And when you get up close to it, you can see there's now a little bit of the seam allowance to the right side of the zipper due to our basting. And this little strip of seam allowance next to the zipper is what's magically going to make the underlap side have about a 1/2 inch seam allowance instead of a 5/8 inch seam allowance, so the zipper is tucked under the lap. Now when you do have this flipped over, make sure that you don't have any of the garment fabric tucked into this little edge, because we're going to sew on this. We just want to make sure that that is only one thickness of fabric and it's just the seam allowance there. So the garment is free of this, because we're going to sew the zipper to the underlap side with a zipper foot right along this narrow little seam allowance that we made. And if you want to keep things really flat here in order to sew this, which can be helpful for thick fabrics, you can just take a few little pins to flatten this out before we sew it. So now we're just going to sew right against the zipper tape on the right side on the sewing machine with our zipper foot. By the way, you can technically do this without the prior basting step at all. If you feel comfortable, just fold the garment under to the right like we did after the basting. Scoot a little bit of that seam allowance out and pin the zipper to that to sew this next step. I've done both, so try this yourself and see what works better for you. And now we'll just sew the right side of the zipper tape on the machine with a zipper foot. And here's my line of stitching, a little wonky since this is just a sample. And if you basted, remove the basting stitches now. And flip this to the outside of the garment, give it a good press, and you'll see how this is all nice and flat now. And we're going to top stitch the lap side. Since the seam is still basted shut still, this is one of the reasons why this is such a great method, since everything stays perfectly nice and flat and in place. Now we're going to top stitch down the length of the zipper on the machine, ending with a little horizontal line at the bottom, right above the zipper stop. Although if you misjudge this where the zipper stop is and it ends up below it, don't worry, I've done both. You just don't want to hit the stop when you're doing this. So what I like to do is take a pin and place it just above the zipper stop and have it poke out through the other side. So when I mark that little horizontal line, I am just above it, so I'm just clear of that. If you'd like, you can chalk or mark the top stitching line or use a piece of tape as a guide. The lap needs to be about 1/2 inch to 3/8 of an inch wide to the top stitching line, but you have to make sure that you're going to catch the seam allowance and the edge of the zipper tape on this side. So depending on the width of your zipper and how far set in it is, it could be more or less to one side. So measure where you think that you'll want your line of top stitching, and I'll just pretend that that's right about here, and stick a pin right in that spot. And check and make sure that you've caught the zipper tape, which I did, and look to make sure you've also caught the seam allowance, which I also did. So that would be a good stitching line. And if you didn't catch either of those, you'll need to move your line just a little bit closer to that center seam line. I top stitch from the top and go down to the little horizontal line and then sew that last, but check out a Closet Historian's lap zipper tutorial. She starts at the bottom and then works her way up, and that's a great way to try. So do whatever works for you. She also shows you how you can do a prick stitch, which is done by hand and is a lovely couture touch, and it's great for fabrics that truly have a mind of their own too. I'll link her video in the description. She's fabulous. Now you may have noticed that I'm using a walking foot for this, and I'll explain more about that and the zipper length in my tips section at the end, but more commonly you'd probably use a zipper foot. If you prefer, you can always tie off the threads at the back of the work instead of back stitching. Remove any marking lines you drew, give this a press, and your zipper is done. We just have to remove the machine basting stitches in the seam line, and it's easy to know where they end at the base since we ripped that last stitch out earlier, instead of accidentally ripping into your normal stitches below the zipper end. And you now have a perfect looking lap zipper, nice and smooth every time, even on curved hips. So all that's left now is sewing your waistband per your pattern's instructions. And if you're not following instructions for your waistband, just know that the top stitched side should have the waistband ending in line with the seam allowance, which would be on this side of my sample. And then the underlap side will need about 1 inch or more extra of the waistband. I have a little longer than I needed here because I basically just eyeballed these. And that forms the little facing to attach a hook or a button closure. And if you've done like me and have your zipper ends hanging off the end, don't worry about these just yet. Just go ahead and sew on your waistband and we will take care of those in a minute. Now once you've sewed your waistband seam, and I'm pretending that this is my waistband here, you'll cut the ends off the zipper before you close up your waistband if you used a longer zipper like I did. So all you need to do is just trim down the end of the zipper and trim off the extra teeth close to the seam line. I'm just not going to cut it off here because I plan to reuse the zipper, but you can just pretend with me here that if I was folding this up, that last little bit here would just get enclosed in the seam, just like here on this skirt. And really, it doesn't add any bulk at all. But wait, we're not done here. Here's a few more helpful tips. Now, what if you sew lap zippers, but the zipper peeks out a little bit more than you'd like, kind of like on this skirt, although it doesn't really bother me, but it might bother you. Or perhaps you struggle with catching the seam allowance or the zipper tape on the back with your top stitching. You can actually inset the zipper a little bit more under the overlap side. So basically, instead of the right side being a 1/2 inch seam allowance in the end, it's a little closer to 3/8 of an inch. If you're using the method I described earlier and are laying the zipper face down and basting, instead of centering the zipper teeth directly on the seam line, move the zipper teeth just a little to the left of the center when looking at it from above. It may seem like it should be to the right, but trust me on this. Now, if you choose not to hand or machine baste, but just fold over that little edge yourself, just make sure that it's a little wider than 1/8 of an inch. And if your fabric is thick like this corduroy, it's probably going to happen automatically. And that's actually exactly how I did it for this pair of corduroy pants. Another way to illustrate this is from the inside. You can see how far the zipper teeth are from the fold line on the top stitch side on our standard sample. And then on this pair of pants where I told you that I inset it a little bit more. So this little seam allowance here is just a little bit wider. So this tweak just moves the zipper teeth slightly more under the top stitch left side when everything is done. Okay, so what's up with the zipper length? A few of you have asked me about that in other videos too. Here's why I like to use a zipper that's a little bit longer than necessary for using this particular type of lap zipper method for pants and skirts. Not all methods though, we'll cover those in future videos in this series. Because you top stitch with the zipper still basted shut in this method, the zipper pull has a tendency to occasionally get in the way a little bit when you're trying to top stitch this with a zipper foot. But you can avoid this issue altogether if the zipper is a little bit longer than you need, because the zipper pull hangs off the top of the fabric here and the pull never gets in your way. Plus, it's also just a quick way to handle things if you only have a zipper that matches that's a little bit longer than you need and you don't feel like taking the time to cut off the end and sew a new zipper stop by hand. Now, I told you that I use a walking foot to top stitch my zipper. This can also be called an even feed foot. And you can watch my walking foot tips video for more, but because it walks like this, there's no concern over the height difference between the zipper teeth and the rest of the fabric. So it just goes smoothly along without any problem at all. And because of this, it's also helpful in preventing bumps in long center back zippers in the method I prefer to use for dresses, but we'll cover that in a future video in this series. So if you're frustrated trying to top stitch a lap zipper, try a longer zipper and a walking foot. Remember, sewing is all about finding what works for you, personal hacks included. So try it all and use it as a jumping off point to find your favorite ways to do things. In the meantime, you might like one of these other two videos, and I'll be back to talk more about lap zippers in the future. Lumps and bumps in top instead of invisible zippers.